nothing would go to waste. And when we're no longer doing the bone-in, slow-cooked cuts of meat and the bone broth and making use of the skin and, these tough cuts, we're getting much less collagen in our diets than is probably the norm for humans. So I'm okay with collagen supplements. They are not a complete protein. This is true. They're lacking the amino acid tryptophan. And so some people have said, oh, it doesn't count towards your protein intake. That's actually not true. They did do a study on this where they replaced a third of people's dietary protein intake with collagen and saw if it messed up their amino acid balance.
Today's guest is Nichols, who has quite literally changed my life. I'm someone who considers myself rather healthy. I've always had an interest in health and wellness and taking care of my body. So when I learned many of the facts that we're going to chat about today with Lily, who is a registered dietitian nutritionist, I was shocked that I was doing some things incorrectly. Much of the common nutrition advice we receive, especially as women, is not actually rooted in the current data. In fact, sometimes we're actually given advice that's the opposite of what is most helpful for us. Lily has a passion for evidence-based nutrition, especially when it comes to women's health. She is the best-selling author of 3 books that are actually used as textbooks in some nutrition curriculums, and her work was actually central to the reform of the Czech Republic's updated 2016 gestational diabetes guidelines. If you're a woman in your 20s, 30s, 40s, this episode will enlighten you in ways you didn't expect. My weekly Q&As on Instagram have taken off in ways I haven't expected, and because the whole point of them is that I answer the questions during my 10-minute LED mask treatment, I only have 10 minutes, and so I can't get to the hundreds and hundreds of questions that come in every week. So I'm going to start answering just 1 or 2 of them at the beginning of my episodes, starting with what is my favorite retinoid alternative for pregnancy. And the short answer is there is no retinoid alternative, pregnant or not. Retinoids are in a class all on their own. I used all of my other ingredients, all my normal skincare while pregnant. I just took out my retinol and hydroquinone. I also did add in azelaic acid, which is not specific to pregnancy, but it can help to increase cell turnover. It can help to improve uneven skin tone, skin texture. It can help to quench breakouts. It can help a little bit with melasma if you're experiencing that. I have a whole pregnancy guide. So if you go to skinenthusiast.com/pregnancy, you can sign up to get everything sent to you very easily, including the routines that I personally used when I was pregnant in the morning and in the evening. The next question is, what are my favorite tips for preventing breakouts in the summer? So for summer specific breakouts, which usually occur because we have an increase of sunscreen, increase of sweat, and our pores tend to become more clogged during the summer months for some of us, what I like to do is add in some sort of an exfoliating toner pad. So these are those little pads that you always see. They contain exfoliating ingredients that can help to unclog the pore, can help to dissolve the dirt and oil. And at night, it's kind of that extra cleansing step. So after you've already double cleansed, you can ensure that all of your sunscreen and makeup is removed with these pads. So the ones that I love are the Bare Face toning pads. I also love the Dr. Dennis Gross toning pads, and I will put those below in my description for you guys. I want to start by saying thank you, because I'm sure you get this all the time, but your advice actually changed my life in many ways. And I was someone who thought I was eating healthy. I've always been very into health and wellness since I was a young girl. And when I became pregnant, I was having a beautiful pregnancy until about midway through, and I got hit with a ton of issues. I had gestational diabetes, I had preeclampsia that eventually became severe and resulted in an early delivery. And when I went in to see maternal fetal medicine after I got diagnosed with all these things, basically in one weekend, they were shocked. They were like, this isn't usually the type of patient we see come through the door with all of these issues. And so I was recommended your book on gestational diabetes, and I started reading it and realized I was doing a lot of things incorrectly that I thought I was doing right. So I just wanted to start by saying thank you. And this advice is really, I think, beneficial for all women, regardless of where you're at in your childbearing journey. So that's kind of why I wanted to bring you on the podcast, which is primarily about skin. We do talk a lot about wellness in general. So I want to thank you for being here and taking the time. I know you're super busy.
Yeah, well, happy to be here. And I'm sure I can imagine being hit with those diagnoses like one after the other was really stressful to experience during your pregnancy. I am glad that my resources helped out just a little bit, but I know that stress can feel really overwhelming, especially, when it kind of seems to be coming out of nowhere and you don't necessarily have like underlying risk factors. It feels especially unfair.
Yeah. And I think the good, the silver lining of it all is that it probably unearthed some issues that I wasn't aware that I had. Obviously having those conditions puts me at an increased risk of developing hypertension and diabetes later in life. So knowing that now, I can kind of use diet, nutrition, exercise to curb that as much as possible. But I wanted to start by asking you, what do you think, because we have a lot of people who are interested in getting into medicine in some form, what do you think is lacking when it comes to traditional dietary education, whether it be for an RD or in medical school or these other professions?
Well, medical schools often don't have any nutrition education, or if they do, they have like a 3-credit class and that's it. RDs, of course, have a fairly involved background in nutrition and science, 4, 5, 6 years potentially of training. The challenge with an RD program, and to be clear, that's my background, is that really most of the information is reflective of what has been kind of the norm for dietary guidelines since like the 1980s. I am hearing from newer dietitians that there is more open discussion, questioning some of the guidelines now. I think there's more professionals who are like, wait a minute, this seems a little outdated. Wait a minute, we have studies on this. But for the most part, the textbooks, the teaching material really tends to, at least my experience back then, was that it fell in line with whatever the dietary guidelines are. So, low fat, high carb, limit your saturated fat intake, limit your salt intake, eat more fruits and vegetables and whole grains. Like that was kind of like the advice in a nutshell.
And what are your thoughts on the argument, because this is something we hear a lot in the wellness space, that the dietary regulations and recommendations we have may not be specific to women because there's kind of this lack of data when it comes to women, specifically of childbearing age? I think sometimes it's a very hot topic in the wellness space. So I'm curious, from your evidence-based standpoint, do you really feel like this is an issue, or is it something that these kind of like wellness bros like to tout?
No, it's indeed an issue. So most of our recommendations do, if there is evidence behind them, because some of them, it seems like, you look at the evidence used to back them and it's pretty shoddy. But the ones where we do have human data backing them, most of that evidence derives from adult men. That's not only, the macronutrient recommendations, but the micronutrient recommendations as well. So vitamins and minerals. Women are complicated to study because we have this monthly hormonal cycle. Pregnancy is complicated to study. A lot of types of study designs you cannot do ethically during pregnancy. Even some of the study designs that they originally did on adult men in like the early and mid 1900s would be considered unethical nowadays, like depriving people of essential nutrients for a prolonged period of time. Like you can't ethically do that anymore. You certainly can't ethically do that during pregnancy or lactation. In addition, there's just all sorts of complexities introduced in pregnancy and lactation that make it really challenging to recruit. So like, blood markers for different things. The reference ranges many times have not been clearly defined by trimester, and sometimes they do shift. Do you want all your participants enrolling at 13 weeks or 17 weeks or 20 weeks or 36 weeks? Sometimes it's hard to find a population of women who are at a similar stage of pregnancy for a large enough cohort to draw statistical significance from. There's all of these things that make it a challenge. So yeah, the majority of the data is based on assumptions or studies from adult men. They are usually adjusted down for women because we tend to weigh less than men. And then for pregnancy and lactation, they tend to adjust their recommendations up. Sometimes we have limited like animal studies or some human studies where there's like 5 pregnant women and their babies. I mean, really, it's really, really very limited, but they usually adjust some of the nutrient levels up for pregnancy and lactation. But really, a lot of what we're working on is best guesses.
I see this a lot in skincare when people ask, is this ingredient pregnancy safe? And it's like, well, we've never studied it on pregnant women because like the majority of these ingredients, there are no studies, but we can deduce based on XYZ, yes or no. So it's definitely a limitation in my field too. And I want to talk a little bit about women's health in general before we get into like more pregnancy specific recommendations. So as women, this is a big, hot topic in the wellness space too. What protein amounts should we be shooting for as women? And how does this change then when we do become pregnant?
Yeah, so there's sort of two ways of looking at this, like minimum amounts and optimal amounts. And again, we can be somewhat limited by what data we have, especially with pregnancy. So I would say at a minimum, bare minimum, I would say 1.2 grams per kilograms of body weight. That would hold true also for the first trimester, early part of pregnancy. Just as a whole, generally your nutrition requirements don't increase all that much until you're a little bit further along. But when you're looking at optimal, it's very likely we need a minimum of 1.5 to even 2.2 grams per kilogram, which translates to, if you look at 2.2 grams per kilogram, that's a gram of protein per pound of body weight, right? As we get further along in pregnancy, your protein requirements do increase. So I don't recommend people dip below 1.5 grams per kilogram body weight in the latter half of pregnancy. That is a stage where we do have pregnancy-specific data, and that was a minimum threshold that was uncovered in that research, and many women need more. So you have women who are really active. If you're really active and you have a lot of muscle turnover, you're also burning a lot more energy, it's likely your protein requirements are more.
And what do you feel about supplementing in these situations when someone isn't able to get, especially in early pregnancy, when it's hard for some people to kind of get the protein down? What are your thoughts on supplementing with protein powders?
I'm okay with it if the protein powder is good quality, has been third-party tested for contaminants and like heavy metals, for example, hasn't been hexane extracted. So it's, again, like low toxin. I do caution for protein powders that they don't make up the bulk of your protein intake, that they really are used as a supplement. Just because our protein-rich foods are not just providing protein, they're also providing us with a lot of other nutrients as well that you might not necessarily be getting in the protein powder itself. That's just the isolated protein component. But yeah, things like a beef protein isolate, collagen protein, high quality whey protein, or even egg white protein, those will all be like really, really excellent options if you're really struggling with the food aversions, nausea, and the only thing that you can get down the hatch is like a smoothie or something. You may as well pack some extra protein in there.
And what are your thoughts on collagen supplements as a whole? Because, we've heard that it's not a complete protein, but it also gives us those amino acids. So what are your thoughts in adding those in for women's health or in pregnancy?
So I'm a big fan of collagen supplementation. I mean, as a whole, humans are eating less collagen than they ever did before. We used to be a culture where we would consume all the parts of the animal. Nothing would go to waste. And when we're no longer doing the bone-in, slow-cooked cuts of meat and the bone broth and making use of the skin and, these tough cuts, we're getting much less collagen in our diets than is probably the norm for humans. So I'm okay with collagen supplements. They are not a complete protein. This is true. They're lacking the amino acid tryptophan. And so some people have said, oh, it doesn't count towards your protein intake. That's actually not true. They did do a study on this where they replaced a third of people's dietary protein intake with collagen and saw if it messed up their amino acid balance or essential amino acid metabolism or anything. And it actually did not. The people who were taking in the collagen actually had better amino acid metabolism than those who were not taking in the collagen. So from that data, we could say you could easily get a third of your protein coming from collagen and still be fine. And by the way, that study used the very lowest benchmark of protein, like our conventional RDA, which for women is like 45 grams of protein. It's like super low, right? So they had like 30 grams of protein plus like 15 grams of collagen peptides. So you can imagine somebody who's actually getting a reasonable, more optimal amount of protein, really the chances that 10 or 30 grams of collagen protein is going to mess anything up is pretty slim to none. And in fact, you're providing your body with amino acids that can be more challenging to get otherwise. So I am a fan of collagen protein. Many of the amino acids that are in it are needed in higher amounts during pregnancy because we have such a higher demand for collagen. You have a lot more collagen turnover. You're also growing babies' skeleton, joints, their skin, their organs, their vascular system. That all requires glycine and some of the other amino acids in collagen.
Oh, that's so good to know. And I know that you're a fan of bone broth, making your own bone broth at home. I am too. What about for someone who they're not into it and they'd rather I've seen some of those powdered bone broth options. Do you think they're helpful in any way, or do you think people should just go to the powdered collagen instead?
I'm okay with either one. I would get third-party testing, like see if the company does independent third-party testing on their products for any products, I would say, actually, to see like, is it actually clean? But even like a beef protein isolate that I mentioned earlier, a good proportion of the protein component in those products is actually coming in from collagen. So yeah, whether it's bone broth protein, beef protein isolate, collagen. The collagen, of course, you'll be getting like the pure collagen. The other ones would technically be considered complete protein, even though there's a good amount of collagen in it. So your preference.
So I also want to say for the audience that I know I'm asking a lot of questions about powders, and this is really just because I think, we're all busy women and we try to fill the gaps where we can, but it's not the recommended way to get most of these nutrients, right? Our food is the recommended way to get all of these helpful nutrients and vitamins. But I like to have these options, and especially coming from an expert like you, so we know what choices to make when there are those gaps in our diets.
Yeah, for sure.
I did have an audience question come in. What are your thoughts on colostrum supplements?
I have mixed opinions on it. I think they can be helpful for a short-term need for like gut repair or immune system support. I think it's a little bit odd how I see a lot of influencers using it like every single day, like forever and ever. I mean, I like to think through things from like an ancestral lens. Like, when would you even have access to colostrum other than like when a human baby is born and all that colostrum is going to the baby? You may have like dairy cows or goats or sheep, and that nursing animal is only going to be producing colostrum for a very short period of time. So even if you may, after the baby animal gets enough, the humans may have a little bit for themselves. This would really only be during that very early lactation period. So I don't know that it makes sense from an ancestral perspective that you'd be having it every day, but can it be used for short-term benefit? Sure. I mean, it's can be very helpful for the gut and immune system. So I think if it's indicated for the short term, sure. I'm not really convinced on the long-term use.
I think it's like a lot of things in the wellness space, we kind of tend to get fixated on things and sometimes overdo it a little bit, and it's not a one-size-fits-all answer. There are circumstantial reasons why we might or might not want something like that.
Totally.
And last audience question for this section, what are your thoughts on raw milk?
I mean, if you have access to good raw milk from a farm that you trust, they're hygienic, they feed their cows what cows are meant to eat, like primarily grass and forage, and it's a cleanly operation, I have no problem with it. I think it all comes down to how it's handled, how the animals are raised, whether they're healthy animals or not. So I don't think it has to be like all the dairy you eat has to be raw necessarily. If you have access to it, great. As somebody who has moved around quite a bit in my adult life, I've not always had access to good quality raw dairy. I just haven't always had a source. And other times I have had a source. If I have a source, I'm going to have some. When I don't have a source, I mean, granted, I'm not somebody who has adverse effects necessarily from pasteurized dairy, but I think we do need to also acknowledge there's a lot of nutrition even in pasteurized dairy, even if you're not getting the optimal, like the intact lactase and the probiotics and the enzymes and all the things, dairy is still full fat, organic, grass-fed dairy is still a really nutrient-dense food, whether it's raw or not. I do dig into more of the like controversy, the food safety issues, the benefits, and all that in chapter 3 of Real Food for Fertility. If people want to like really dive into some of the data on it, we do have a whole section going through like quality dairy, considerations with raw, unhomogenized, like all the things for people who really want to go deep on this.
Awesome. And we're going to link all 3 books down below, but I'll make sure to make that note too when we link it, that for the chapter reference. And I want to chat a little bit about blood sugar, because I firmly believe that blood sugar is something that we should all be tuned into, but unfortunately many of us are not, like myself, until it became an issue. And, you know, with a diagnosis like gestational diabetes, it seemingly came out of nowhere. But then the more I learned about blood sugar balance and looked back to as far as like my high school years and how often I was getting that really jittery, like almost out of body experience because my blood sugar was so low and not realizing it. Or I remember having friends who were diagnosed with hypoglycemia, but you know, the majority of these issues are reactive, right, from some sort of episode of hyperglycemia. And it's just something we don't think about. So, you know, I think even if you don't have a personal history yet, or even a family history of blood sugar issues, I think it's something in today's society that we all struggle with without even really realizing it.
Yeah, I mean, well, half of the US population has some form of diabetes or prediabetes, and most of it's undiagnosed, right? But even with somebody who may have like good results on tests, and I'm one of those people, I, like you, I struggled really, really badly with frequent hypoglycemia in my younger years. So reactive hypoglycemia. And it wasn't until I was older and was already working like in the diabetes space that I was like, oh, that's what was going on. So the biggest thing for me, I mean, my approach to this has shifted over the years. I used to be more from the standpoint of we just need to like reduce the refined carbs, you know, balance the macros or something. And yes, these things are still important, but I tend to focus now more from the standpoint of increasing protein and fat. And as a byproduct of that, you're probably going to reduce your carbohydrate intake because you simply won't be quite as hungry. But we really need to like narrow down on the protein and the fat. So if you are the type who consistently undereats protein and fat, you are by default going to be eating more carbohydrates. And when you have carbohydrate intake without it being paired with enough protein and fat, you'll see a large spike in blood sugar, which your body combats with a large bolus of insulin released from your pancreas, and then your blood sugar will plummet until it gets to that reactive hypoglycemia stage, and you start feeling shaky, jittery, weak, extremely hungry, maybe sweaty, like anxiety can be like a common symptom, just not yourself. Hangry, some people get really irritable when their blood sugar is low. I know I'm one of those people, but I have found the only way to really combat that long term, because conventionally they'll just say, oh, if your blood sugar is low, eat more carbs.
Right.
Which is fine. That is an immediate solution. It will immediately bring your blood sugar back up, followed by another low, right? It doesn't interrupt the cycle. It treats the immediate symptom, but it doesn't prevent it from happening again. To prevent it from happening again, you really need to make sure you're eating enough food, and specifically eating enough food that doesn't raise your blood sugar. Protein and fat do not. Our non-starchy vegetables do not. Our like low glycemic carbohydrates don't raise your blood sugar quite as much as the other ones. But if you're missing out on protein, you're just going to keep going low. So having solved that issue for myself and many, many others, it's like we got to really go ham on the protein, particularly at breakfast, because you've set the stage for your blood sugar control for the rest of your day with your breakfast intake. So gosh, I've written about this for so long, like at least 15 years. I have like an ancient article on my blog called The Healthy Breakfast Mistake. I have several articles on CGM experiments that I have done personally, and I've talked about, you know, the breakfast component, because guess what? If you start your morning with a bowl of cereal or oatmeal or a smoothie that's made with all fruit, just like fruit pureed, it's not that any of those foods are necessarily bad in and of themselves. They're just pretty much pure carbohydrate, and you're going to have a large blood sugar spike followed by an equally large crash, and you're just not going to be feeling well. So run the experiment for yourself. Try swapping out for a few days for a higher protein breakfast, like have eggs and bacon or something, and see how do you feel in the rest of the day. That morning, do you have that like 10 a.m. slump where you want coffee or something sugary, or you sneak over to the break room and grab a donut? Like, does that craving hit? How do you feel at lunch? Are you absolutely famished before you have lunch? Or do you feel like pretty even keeled, but like I could eat? These things give us clues as to what's happening with our blood sugar levels. They don't tell us exactly where they're at. You would have to test to see that, but they do give you clues. These symptoms do often, reflect what's happening inside.
This episode is brought to you by, well, me. Skinthusiast.com is your one-stop shop for all things skin, hair, and beauty. I have countless blog posts to educate you on all the skin concerns and most common skin questions I receive. We also have a complete skincare basics guide on our shop page, as well as the cutest In My Skin era crew necks. If you want to support the show, please head over to skinthusiast.com/shop, and don't forget to rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts. I remember reading one time years ago that you really should be able to go, 5-6 hours without a snack, and still feel okay. And that was such an eye-opening experience for me, because I was like, no, I can go maybe 2, and I start to get that jittery feeling. And it was an eye-opener that I had to change my diet. And when I did my gestational diabetes test, the 3-hour test, I remember I had to leave there after the 3rd blood draw and go straight to my first appointment with the high-risk doctor after all these diagnoses. And I crashed in their office. Like, I have never experienced a crash like that in my life. And now I realize it's because my blood sugar was over 200. I didn't know it at the time because I didn't have the results back from the test from after drinking the glucose drink. But I was like, could not process what she was saying, sweating, like nearly passed out. And I remember at that moment knowing exactly what was happening and knowing what it probably meant for my results. But once I was able, I had to start checking my blood sugar multiple times a day, of course, as you know. And once I started taking the tips from your book, Real Pregnancy for Gestational Diabetes, I never had a high level that I didn't expect. Like, there were a couple nights we went out to dinner and I had a dessert like maybe once or twice for the remainder of my pregnancy. And so I knew it was going to be slightly elevated. But even that, my doctors were shocked that I wasn't going to need insulin because of how high my levels were after the tests. And I know that this isn't the case for everybody. There's people who do everything right and they still end up needing insulin. But she, at the end of my pregnancy, she was like, you don't even have to check anymore. Like, if you're due, because I have been checking for weeks and weeks and showing her my numbers, and she's like, you don't even need to check. You're doing everything right. They're never high. And that was all thanks to the tips in your book.
Well, congrats and good job. Well done.
Yeah, and it's all, when you think about it now, it seems like common sense in hindsight, but at the time it didn't. It was some new concepts for me, especially protein. I was vegetarian for the first part of my pregnancy, or pescatarian. I had been for 4 years. And so I started eating meat again at the end of that pregnancy. My daughter also had intrauterine growth restriction, which at the time I was told couldn't have anything to do with my diet. And I do think it was probably related to the preeclampsia, but, going forward in any potential future pregnancies, I certainly will not be eating a vegetarian diet.
Yeah, the protein intake does play a big role on that component, baby's growth. So yeah, I hear that a lot. My books have had, an increasingly more detailed information about that as time has gone on, as you may have noticed if you've read multiple. So like I didn't even broach the subject of vegetarian diets and real food for gestational diabetes because I felt like I don't want to talk about something that I'm not necessarily going to recommend. So like, why would I waste space in the book on this? I'm just going to talk about what's optimal. Of course, I got a lot of questions after the fact. Hey, I'm vegetarian. What do I do? And my experience in practice was that those were by far the most challenging cases to achieve blood sugar control. And then in Real Food for Pregnancy, I included a small section, sort of an addendum to chapter 3 on a vegetarian diet and some of the nutrients of concern. And then in Real Food for Fertility, it has it's a whole chapter to the topic in and of itself. It's become clear to me that this is a really important topic that we have more detailed conversations on, and conversations that are not emotionally or ideologically driven, as many of them are, and instead just taking it straight from the science, from the data. I mean, I've been vegetarian myself. Many of my loved ones are still vegetarian or vegan. So like I get all the pros and cons, all the reasons for or against, and I'm just kind of filling in the gaps with the data. Okay, like, well, here's what we know, and here's the things that you need to, be aware of. But I've heard many, many stories similar to your own. So it certainly can be preeclampsia, of course. There can be issues with like the, vascularization of the placenta and the blood flow, and that in and of itself can affect fetal growth. Protein intake also has been shown pretty unequivocally to help promote optimal fetal growth and possibly help promote optimal vascularization and placentation in early pregnancy, because preeclampsia often is a response to some issue with the placenta formation, which happens in the first trimester primarily. It's completed early in the second trimester. So it's one of those things where, it's a complication that's really, we have so many unknowns, and we have a lot of clues and a lot of possibilities and a lot of areas where we can try to optimize. But it's one of those things where it's like, how far do we have to rewind the clock to like truly find like a reliable like preventative for it? I don't know that we're there yet necessarily with the science, but it certainly opens up many, many interesting possibilities. And to, make you feel better, I have many, many cases, both personally and people who reach out to me over email or social media where they had a certain pregnancy complication like preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, and it does not reoccur in their next pregnancy, even though the statistics would say your likelihood of having the same thing again is really high. It really, that's not always the case. Not everybody falls into, those statistics. So yeah, we can always take steps to try to optimize and prevent or mitigate. And I try to highlight all the ways we can do that in my work.
Yeah, absolutely. And even if those steps don't prevent a recurrence of the disease, it could potentially maybe reduce the severity of that disease. Or also, there's so many benefits to making these changes outside of these complications in pregnancy. So I think just knowing that you're really setting yourself up for the most optimal pregnancy, even if some of these things do occur, I still call it a win that you're able to support your baby in that way. And I think I'm glad that you did add this information to the books, because I know for myself, I thought that the vegetarian diet was the most healthful diet. But if someone had given me the data, which eventually I did get, that said, oh, actually in pregnancy, this, and this, there's no question, I would have immediately changed. And I think that's something that people can understand as well, even if you're vegan or vegetarian for ethical reasons or whatever your reasoning is. Pregnancy is such a short window of time, and the preconception period, it's still okay to make some changes to your diet during that time for the optimal health of your baby and your pregnancy, and then reevaluate after. I think we have to normalize that it's okay to make these changes, and our priorities change when we become pregnant.
That's right. Yeah, there's so many different factors that can come into play there. So yeah, the other thing about making changes with the hopes that it might prevent or mitigate a complication is that even if it doesn't pan out, you still have that peace of mind that, what, I did everything that I could, and I know everything in pregnancy isn't within my control, but I took all the steps that I could. So I did my best, and you can feel kind of at peace with that as well. So if anyone's listening and facing similar, hopefully that's a little reassurance.
Yeah, I think of myself in that situation, and I do think I would feel very comforted knowing that at least I took all the steps I could. And to be honest, I'm glad I didn't learn the bit about, I started eating protein again because I was trying to balance my blood sugar, but I didn't quite understand the connection with preeclampsia and fetal growth restriction and protein at the time. And I'm really glad I didn't learn it till later, because I probably would have felt really terrible, felt so guilty while I was pregnant. And I know some of these things were out of my control, but yeah, I definitely wish I would have known that information before, which is why I recommend your books to all of my friends who are even thinking about getting pregnant, because I'm like, this is the time. I actually have a little, because I get so much PR and stuff, I have a little gifting closet where I keep gifts that are ready to give people. And I just purchased a bunch of your books on Amazon, because anytime a friend gets pregnant, And like this, I know it's not like the fluffy, fun, always, book to read, but I think it's the most essential book, especially Real Food for Pregnancy for people who are pregnant. And then obviously if you have the complication or if you're starting to think about pregnancy, Real Food for Fertility. I mean, they're just life-changing. So I want to talk a little bit about fertility. So for someone who wants to get pregnant in maybe the next 2 to 5 years, are there any, I know we don't have a lot of time to cover it all, but just maybe 1 or 2 tips you can give them for diet and lifestyle?
Well, first and foremost, the conversation we had about protein also applies to the preconception window as well, and not being so restrictive with your protein intake that you're taking the fat out of all of your protein foods, because you do need fat and cholesterol for your hormone production. We actually have data from studies where they put women on a low-fat diet and their progesterone and estrogen levels tank. So when you're trying to optimize your cycle and your egg quality in advance of conception, and then of course once you conceive, now your body has to really ramp up production of those hormones. You need the raw materials to actually pull that off. So don't get super restricted on the fat. I would definitely focus on increasing your intake of nutrient-dense foods during that preconception time as well. This can optimize your menstrual cycle health, hormone production, egg quality. A lot of the same stuff holds true for sperm quality as well, so your partner can eat the same foods as you, but really focus on building in more of those foods. And to be specific, this does include a lot of animal foods, eggs, meat, organ meats, seafood and fish, shellfish, full-fat dairy products, as well as plant foods as well. I mean, legumes are still good, fruits and vegetables are still great, like building in those antioxidant-rich foods as well is also key. But those will provide you with like the actual building blocks for your hormones and the micronutrients that you need for keeping your blood sugar levels at a healthy range, your oxidative stress at a healthy level. All of these things work together for fertility. So I would say those 2 tips would be my top ones, like improve the diet quality, really emphasize the protein. As a consequence of that, you will probably be eating less processed foods, which if you want to take it from the opposite side of the coin, those have detrimental effects on many things. And I'll just share a statistic because this might not be relevant to your audience, but as the general public in the US, 58% of calories are coming from ultra processed food in the average American diet. So if we can take even like the tiniest little steps to displacing some of the processed stuff, we're going to be improving our nutritional status and our fertility. This is why I try to focus on add more of these things, and then by consequence, some of these things that are less nutritious will just be kind of pushed out of the way.
I also, on that note, eating more whole foods, I often hear the argument, and I've heard you mention it on another podcast before, but I often hear the argument that, it's too expensive to buy organic. So people kind of fall into this, situation where they don't have the money to spend on an organic or pasture-raised whole foods diet. And so they kind of slip into other things that are less expensive. But so what are your thoughts on someone who maybe thinks, well, I'm eating organic packaged foods basically because I can't afford the organic whole foods?
Well, the organic packaged foods are actually really expensive. So I don't buy a lot of organic packaged foods because they're crazy expensive. I think we have to kind of level set here and come back to the basics with food. There's always going to be an exchange of either time or money. So the processed stuff saves us time but costs more money. The unprocessed stuff takes time, but it saves us money. And so you have to kind of make the call on what is a priority for your household. I'm of the opinion that most of the processed, even healthier pre-made things, which are so expensive, by the way, they don't even taste good. Every time I'm like, you know what, I'm lazy, I'm just gonna get the packaged thing. It's this doesn't even taste good. The amount of food that I got from this package is a quarter of if I had made the thing from scratch, but costs the same. and tastes worse. So I think we have to, regardless of the food quality conversation, just get back to cooking more things from scratch. I think among the like unprocessed items, we simply have to do the best that we can with whatever is, in our budget. I do have an article on my website, technically prenatal's in the title, but it applies to anyone. It's called Budget Friendly Prenatal Nutrition or something, going through some of the options, because there's many different like levels of like budget consciousness to full-blown food insecurity, right? Which like this becomes a different conversation. If organic, no matter what, even if it's the like hasn't been already processed into a ready-made meal, is out of budget, just buy the best quality that you can afford. So, just beef, ground beef that has no other additives in it, just the plain chicken. It's not organic, it's not any other things, but it's just plain chicken with no added ingredients. Use that as your base and add your, vegetables, spices or whatever to turn it into a full meal, and don't get too concerned about, oh, it's not organic, it's not pasture raised, it's not whatever. Like, listen, like I mentioned earlier, I've lived in so many places, and some of the places I've lived do not have the best quality food easily accessible. And so I'm not a household where everything is 100% organic. Even if I write about, when you can, how it's beneficial to not have these exposures to pesticide residues or whatever, at the end of the day, still cooking a whole food meal at home from non-organic whole food ingredients is more of a benefit to our health probably than buying the thing that's pre-made in a package sitting in plastic that we nuke in the microwave. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So,
No, exactly. And that's why I think people kind of freeze up and almost have like decision fatigue when it comes to all of these options. But exactly like you said, just bringing it to the basics and nourishing our body, even if it isn't the strictest standards, we don't all have access to that.
You can prioritize if you're sort of in that intermediate zone where it's like you have some dispensable income, and you can prioritize buying like the dirty dozen vegetables organic because those tend to have the higher pesticide residues, then great, do so. If you can buy organic grass-fed ground beef, because that's affordable, that's maybe $5, $6, $7 a pound, but you can't afford the grass-fed steak, then make more meals with the ground beef, right? Like, there's always ways around what is available to us, and we simply have to just, do the best that we can. But like, here's the thing. A lot of people get really uptight about the animal food quality. Like, oh, well, if I can't buy organic grass-fed, I'm better off just not eating it whatsoever. I'm just not going to eat it at all. But people don't apply those same standards to fruits and vegetables, to grains, to like legumes, to nuts and seeds. It's like, why have we zeroed out the animal foods and been like, well, if it's not organic, I'm just not even going to eat it. But then you don't hold it the same standard for, I feel like everybody can agree some fruit and vegetable intake is better than none, even if it's not organic. We should apply that same logic to animal foods as well. They are still nutritious, my friends. Like, they are still, even conventional beef. I mean, you look at cow, even though, a lot of them are finished in a feedlot, and is that ideal? No. They still spend the majority of their time on grass. If you actually look into it, they do. So I think Sustainable Dish, Diana Rogers, has done some really great work on food accessibility, and yes, we can promote regenerative agriculture and do our best to support those farmers and talk about the benefits, while also not making animal foods that aren't in that upper echelon category off limits or untouchable, because the reality is a majority of the population is going to be, that is their source of food that's affordable, especially in this economy where everything is absolutely insane. I think we have to kind of get off our high horse here a little bit.
I love that you said that. And I coming from a recovering vegetarian, I feel like when I first started incorporating meat back in, I was definitely in that camp where I was still kind of afraid of meat and all the rhetoric behind meat in general from the vegetarian space. So I was definitely in that camp where I wasn't willing to eat it unless it was this, top notch in checking all the boxes for me. And I think that can be very like elitist, especially when we're in like the educational space on social media. It can be very elitist, and probably some people can feel some shame around what they can and can't get and what they have access to. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that part. So I want to wrap up with, what is your most underrated women's health tip? Like an easy change that we are probably all overlooking.
I feel like I've already said it, but I'm going to repeat it again. Protein at breakfast. For literally the entirety of my nutrition career, almost every single client I've worked with, we've had to work on breakfast. Either they're not eating breakfast, especially nowadays, now that intermittent fasting is like, has had its heyday. I don't know, it's kind of dying down a little bit now, but now it's like cool to skip breakfast. Before it was like, I don't have time. And now it's like, oh no, it's intentional. I'm not eating breakfast because I'm intermittent fasting. Or whether it's just people are stuck in the 90s with their breakfast, with it being like cereal or toast or oatmeal or a pastry and coffee, or just coffee. Sorry, coffee is not breakfast. We have a substantial number of people who are just not eating an adequate amount of food. From a fertility perspective, from the pregnancy perspective, lactation, any of those life stages, under eating can really contribute to a lot of issues, either right away or down the line. And so I really encourage people to eat breakfast again and make it a protein-rich breakfast. So many, many different options. Eggs are fantastic. If you scroll my Instagram feed, you'll see a whole bunch of breakfasts that include eggs. Having some kind of high-protein dairy could be an option. Cottage cheese, Greek yogurt, a protein shake, like you mentioned, that could be an option. Leftover dinner doesn't have to be breakfast food. You could just have some of your leftovers from the night before that's protein-rich at your breakfast. Like, find something, but please eat breakfast and make it something that has a decent amount of protein. For most women, I don't like to see protein dip below about 25 grams at breakfast. Many women actually benefit from more. So if we can leave you with one tip, that would be it.
Okay, I have a question for you. As someone who, I am in that camp where I just am not hungry in the morning, like the thought of food like makes me nauseous in the morning. I have been trying, now that I'm like on the horizon considering a second pregnancy, I have been trying to be a lot better about it. But what do you say to someone who isn't eating their first meal until 11 or 12, but then is eating, like I'm still eating 3 meals and like a pretty large protein snack, like a full fat, unsweetened Greek yogurt with nuts and seeds before I go to bed. You think that's still okay, or do you really think the timing matters?
It kind of depends on the case. We go into the nuance on this a little bit in Real Food for Fertility. Actually, we have a whole section on intermittent fasting, and that's worth a read. There's a small proportion of women where intermittent fasting can make sense, although the trials that have been done on this, they are not trials where they skip breakfast. They do an earlier dinner instead.
Right.
So it's
and I know that's
matched.
supposed to be more beneficial, right? If you
more matched
stop
to your
eating
circadian
earlier.
rhythm. I do know individuals like yourself who simply like, my body isn't ready for food until later. If there are signs and symptoms of cycle issues, like maybe someone's kind of on the cusp of hypothalamic amenorrhea, short luteal phase, PMS, low progesterone levels, stuff like that, I do really try to encourage some food within the first 30 to 60 minutes of waking, even if it wouldn't qualify in your mind as breakfast. So for somebody who's like not hungry until later, but we can see some signs of like issues with hormones or menstrual cycle stuff, then I would encourage that eating relatively soon after waking up, but it can be small. So it can be like a small handful of almonds, or like a half portion of yogurt, or just a hard-boiled egg, like something little, like your stomach isn't ready for like a whole bunch of food, but just something little to kind of kickstart your metabolism a little bit. It could even, although this sounds like it's breaking the rules, it could even just be a piece of fruit, right? That wouldn't give you like the protein first thing in the morning, but that would definitely kickstart your metabolism and start building in over time. You will become hungrier earlier in the day. I am one of those people who wakes up and usually wants to eat, but that sometimes I'm not. And on those days, I'll be like, maybe I'll just have something little. I do still consume caffeine. We talk about caffeine and Real Food for Fertility. It can be hit or miss for some women, but consuming caffeine on an empty stomach, as many do, can be more of an issue. So I try to have, if I'm not going to have breakfast right away, a small snack that I'll have with my tea. And then as my appetite builds over the next hour or two, then have my meal. Again, those days for me are rare, but when they happen, it's like, all right, that's what my body wants today, and that's okay. And I think some individuals, it does take a little time for the metabolism to kind of get on board with having food earlier. So just be gentle with yourself. It may take weeks or even months for that to shift, but eventually that oftentimes does shift. And caution, if you are having coffee right upon waking, coffee can act as an appetite suppressant. And so that can contribute to I'm not really hungry to eat until 11 o'clock, which is why I would say have that small snack before you have your coffee. You'll mitigate some of the effects of the caffeine. And maybe for some individuals, they find they do need to taper down on the coffee a little bit. It can affect your hormones too. We talk about that. It's one of the sections where I'm like, people aren't going to like this, but it is what it is.
Yes.
Some individuals are more sensitive to caffeine than others. Some do fine. It doesn't seem to affect their hormones or their cycle, and other individuals have to be much more careful with it. I think a lot of women, especially motivated business women, I mean, I'm calling myself out here too, we try to accomplish a lot in the day, and so caffeine becomes kind of a crutch to give us that early energy boost instead of relying on food. True energy, we're kind of it's like fake energy. We're just running off cortisol. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I have such a conflicted relationship with caffeine. It's I love it. I've gone without it for months. Then I put it back in and I'm like, this is what's been missing from my life. And now I'm on the half calf train. So trying to dial back again, but it's a tough one. Caffeine is a tough one. But that's such a great tip. That tip about just eating something small, like a handful of nuts, I can definitely do that. And I do find that when I regularly eat something earlier, my body does adjust and then becomes hungry in the morning. And then when I fall off and I don't eat until later for a couple of days because I'm busy, I stop getting hungry in the morning. So I can definitely see where my body adjusts.
And watch your cycle too. I mean, a big reason that, Real Food for Fertility, I co-authored with Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. She's a fertility awareness educator. So we built in the cycle education into the conversation because you can often see the effects on your menstrual cycle. That's often your earliest indication that maybe this isn't quite right. So the cool thing is that because it really does respond in real time to your day-to-day, you will see over the next cycle or two whether having a small snack in the morning and sort of transitioning towards having breakfast a little earlier, whether that does improve the cycle. Oftentimes women report, my luteal phase is a few days longer, or my PMS isn't as bad, or I didn't get as bad of cramps, or, my cycle all around is better, easier to manage. So sometimes it'll give us a little hint whether or not we're responding well to it. So that's another way that we can watch for things beyond just our day-to-day energy levels, which of course that gives us real-time information too.
This is why I love these conversations, because these are things I just would never think of. I would never equate my period to how much caffeine I've been consuming. So this is such an insightful conversation. So thank you so much. I know you're super busy. I see you're amazing with interviews. So I'm flattered. I'm honored that you took the time to come on our show. And I know that the audience is really going to get a lot from this episode.
Well, thank you for the invite. It was fun.
Yeah, thank you. Now you can see how Lily's books quite literally changed my life. Having this sort of evidence-based, researched-back education is absolutely priceless. I've changed so many of my dietary habits because of Lily, and I feel better than I ever have just incorporating some of these little tips. I will leave all of Lily's info below, including where to get her best-selling books. One lucky winner is going to get a copy of Lily's newest book, which is Real Food for Fertility. And you guys, if you are even thinking about potentially starting a family in the next 5 years, 3 years, 2 years, next month, this is going to be helpful. But even if you don't plan on having children, I can't emphasize enough that the tips in these books are really helpful for women's health on every level. I wish I had read it when I was a teenager, truly, because I think I would have saved myself a lot of heartache in my dietary ups and downs throughout life, just having this evidence-based information at my fingertips. So all you have to do is follow me and Lily on Instagram, and we'll put all of that information down in the show notes. And let us know in the reel about this video what your biggest takeaway was from this episode, maybe something that you're going to start incorporating into your routine after hearing Lily's education, and we'll pick one winner to win her book. So thank you so much for listening. If you have a second to rate and review the podcast, it really helps us. I would be so appreciative, and I will talk to you